Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Workshop Wednesdays, the fifth and final workshop. I see that we have Howard University in the group, but I think maybe they'll come on a little later. And so we'll start tonight with an intro and welcome by the president of ASALH, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham.
Welcome to the fifth and the final Social Justice Workshop of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. ASALH has hosted Social Justice Workshop Wednesdays as part of the Social Justice Consortium of Howard University, as I like to say, my own alma mater. This larger consortium, under the leadership of Dr. Nikki Taylor at Howard, has been made possible by the Just Futures grant of the Mellon Foundation. And ASALH has the unique privilege of being able to spark conversations and engagement between academia and the community. ASALH has for 106 years brought knowledge of the past and the present condition of people of African descent to a broad audience. That is not simply our audience, but is literally who we are as an organization. We pride ourselves on broadening our reach beyond the classroom, beyond the university setting, and beyond a narrow intellectual perspective. I can say for myself, but I surely speak for all of you when I say how much I have benefited over these past weeks from the brilliance of Lisa Brock's 3 workshops and last week's fascinating talk by activist Serena Sebring. I'd like to know how many of the workshops you have attended. When Michelle Perchot asks you when this returns back to her, please give her this information. Now today, ASALH culminates its workshop series by featuring 2 prominent social justice leaders who epitomize the Social Justice Consortium's 3 pathways to increase knowledge of social justice. Those 3 pathways being research, art, and activism. And our speakers will address one of the most challenging issues of our time, mass incarceration. They focus on practice. And by that, I mean on how to bring meaning and hope to those who are incarcerated and to those who will rejoin society. Alice Kim is the Director of Human Rights Practice at the University of Chicago's Posen Center for Human Rights. She directs the Human Rights Lab and teaches courses on contemporary issues in human rights practice. The lab engages students, scholars, and community in human rights work, addressing mass incarceration and racialized policing. Kim writes, teaches, and organizes around access to education for people who are incarcerated. She focuses on capital punishment, police torture, and the prison system. She teaches at a maximum security prison in Illinois, and she leads the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, community building efforts to connect scholars, teachers, artists, and community leaders with incarcerated students. She's also the co-editor of the book titled The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Toward Freedom. Emily Hooper Lansana is an arts administrator, educator, and performing artist. She is Associate Director of Community Arts Engagement at the Logan Center for the Arts at the University of Chicago. For more than 25 years, Lansana has performed as a storyteller, sharing her work with audiences throughout Chicago and across the country. She enjoys passing on traditions to young people as a coach and mentor with the nationally recognized Rebirth Poetry Ensemble. Her work seeks to give voice to those whose stories are often untold. When I think about the work being done by Alice Kim and Emily Hooper Lansana, I am reminded of the great lawyer and tireless fighter for social justice, Bryan Stevenson, who stated, and I quote his words, "We've got to find ways to get closer to the poor, the neglected, the abused, the excluded, the marginalized, because it's in proximity to these communities that we hear things that we will not otherwise hear. We will see things that we will not otherwise see." Our two speakers today have found ways to do so. So now I'd like to turn over my welcome to ASALH's president-elect. We are very proud of our new president-elect, who is a pioneering figure in social justice studies, Marvin Dulaney.
Thank you, Dr. Higginbotham. Let me also extend greetings to everyone who's on this program on social justice with Howard University. This represents obviously what Dr. Woodson started over 100 years ago, taking the history, taking the scholarship to the people. And this is a very, very important and critical topic that we're addressing today. What many people don't realize, or typically people don't look at the other side of mass incarceration. That is, we look at the fact that indeed all these people are being incarcerated. We don't realize the impact it has on their families. Indeed, it literally takes a breadwinner in most cases, or in many cases, out of the family and put those families in a terrible, stressful situation. So with that, I look forward to hearing from the two scholars this evening, addressing, as I said, one of the most critical and crucial topics in our society today. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining again tonight, our fifth and final workshop. It's been a great 5 Wednesdays. And as many of you know, because I know you've been here for many of the workshops, you're introducing yourselves in the chat and saying where you're from. So please keep that up and use the chat freely throughout the evening. Our presenters will use the chat as well. So if you haven't already clicked on that button and type something in, do it now. So you'll know how to use the chat once it's the time comes. Also, there's a question and answers button. And tonight we'll have limited questions through the presentations, but we'll have time at the end. So enter your questions in the Q&A section. We have moderators that are reviewing the chat and Q&A, and we'll try very hard to make sure that answers are provided. And also look at that raise hand button. If we have time, we may ask you to raise your hand and come online and engage in the discussion. And so that we have as full an active session as possible. But as Dr. Higginbotham said, we really want to know who has been at all 5 workshops. So I see some of you started putting a little in the chat. So right now, everybody, let me know how many sessions you've attended in the chat. Put your number in, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1. Yay, here they come. Yeah. Nice. First. Good. Well, a lot of people coming for the first time and a lot return visitors. Well, thank you for being here tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters tonight, Emily Hooper Lansana and Alice Kim. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much to the ASALH team for inviting us to be in conversation with you tonight. We're really excited to be here and to be talking with you. We actually do want to invite people to engage throughout the workshop. through the chat, and hopefully we'll also be able to engage some folks through audio as well during this workshop. We actually wanted to start off by asking folks a couple of questions so that you can respond in the chat. We want to get a feel for who's in the room. We know that there are some faces we recognize from Chicago here in the Zoom room, and then there are also a lot of names that we don't recognize. So one question we'd love for you to respond to is, have you experienced or witnessed stigma associated with incarceration on your campus or in your community? Seeing a lot of yeses. More yeses. Yep.
We wanted to start out with these questions to get a sense of the experiences that we have all had that touch on the huge challenge of mass incarceration, and to get a sense of how it impacts so many of us. So the next question we'd like to ask is that, is there anyone who has a family member or friend or who has been incarcerated, that your life has been touched by direct experiences with the system of mass incarceration through family members or friends or potentially yourself? And if that is true, if you have had those kinds of experiences, if you could just let us know in the chat, we'd appreciate that. I think one of the things that we see is that sometimes when we're discussing this issue, it is as if it is something far away. And what these questions give us the opportunity to do is a chance to understand that this is something that is really touching most of us.
Okay, so how this is going to work is I'm going to share some stories and some experiences, talk about the work I do with people who are incarcerated at Stateville for about 10-15 minutes. And then Emily is going to do a bit of a Q&A with me, and then we're going to turn to Emily, and Emily will share some of her work as a storyteller and doing storytelling workshops with people who are system impacted. I will then have a chance to ask Emily a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. But again, please do feel free to interact in the chat, ask questions along the way, make comments. I see that many people actually have some experience of the carceral system, so we would love to hear from you throughout. So I'd like to start by sharing a short excerpt from an essay by Raul Dorado, who is an incarcerated writer at Stateville Prison. Stateville is a maximum security prison for people who the state consider men. It's where I teach writing and cultural studies classes, and it's where I facilitate a think tank that is looking at long-term sentencing practices in Illinois and nationally, and also exploring how to interrupt the dominant narrative about people convicted of violent crimes. So this is what Raul has to say. I have a few images that I would like to share. One second.
Alice,
Yes.
go to slideshow.
Okay.
You see slideshow?
Yes, thank you.
Click on that and then play from start.
Great. Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Lisa. All right. So quote from Raul. Here's what he had to say. Prison is not just a place. it is our life. Behind these walls, we form concrete bonds of brotherhood and just about every other imaginable relationship common to ordinary people. The parallels of the slave trade and contemporary mass incarceration are much too similar to be coincidental. Both slaves and modern day prisoners manufacture their own food and clothing and perform many of the services that keep institutions functional. Whereas slaves once harvested wheat for plantation owners, prisoners now fill the barn. Where forced labor once generated profits, our idleness now generates hourly wages. People of color are the coal and wood burning in the furnace of greed and hatred. The years of our life fuel this industry of mass incarceration. Am I a slave? If I resist the notion of being a slave, I risk misplacing my resistance. If I concede that I am a slave, then I admit to things I am not yet ready to admit to. For instance, that I no longer belong to myself. So when Raul speaks of things he is not yet ready to admit to, I think about the things we too may not yet be ready to admit to. How we have created disposable communities where over 2 million people have effectively been disappeared and caged in a place we call prison. So just a few miles from University of Chicago, the campus where I work and teach, nearly 8,000 men and women are languishing behind bars at Cook County Jail. It's the largest single site jail in the United States. It was a hot spot, COVID spot. It's located on 96 acres of land. It employs 3,900 law enforcement officials, prison guards, and other officers, and 7,000 employees. So its reach is vast. At Stateville, which is about 40 miles west of Chicago, that's the image that you see on the screen. It's surrounded by a 30-foot wall. It's where I teach with the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. Raul is caged there alongside 2,700 other people. Many of our students describe prison as a living grave. They say it feels like being buried alive. Most of our students in PNAP are facing life sentences without the possibility of parole or virtual life sentences. While Illinois successfully abolished the death penalty, life sentences represent death by incarceration. For me, these long-term sentences represent the next frontier in the crisis of mass incarceration. So I'll spend most of my time talking about the work we do in the think tank, in particular, a project called Humans of Life Row. But first, I wanted to back up a little bit. My work on prisons started with people on Illinois' death row in the late 1990s. And the 1990s was a very different political climate. In the 1990s, the Get Tough movement had been embraced by Republicans and Democrats alike. Folks may recall that in the 1992 presidential race, candidate Bill Clinton vowed that he would never permit any Republican to be perceived as tougher on crime than he, and to show just how tough on crime he was, Clinton flew to Arkansas while on the campaign trail to oversee the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, a mentally impaired Black man who asked if he could save the dessert for his last meal until after the execution. As President Clinton, Clinton's 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act is to date still the most expansive crime bill in the history of the US. It created dozens of new federal capital crimes, mandated life sentences for people, the 3 strikes and you're out clause, authorized more than $16 billion for state prisons, and state and local police forces. We also saw the beginning of truth in sentencing policies. At this time, states could only receive federal funding if they enacted truth in sentencing. This is a misleading title. What it effectively meant is that people had to serve out all of their time, whereas prior to these truth in sentencing policies, people were often eligible to be to get out, to be released after they served half their time. So getting tough on crime effectively meant creating a culture of criminalization where it was acceptable to have disposable communities. And those who were on death row were certainly considered disposable. So one strategy that death penalty abolitionists employed was to put a human face on the death penalty. And one particularly powerful way that I did this along with people who were part of an organization that I worked with at the time, the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, was to host live from death row events. Ronaldo Hudson is here on this Zoom. Ronaldo Hudson and I first met when Ronaldo was on death row. And he, I hope, will be able to speak to the experience of these live from death row events. It was a different time when technology wasn't what it is now. It was actually extremely difficult to amplify phone calls from prison. It was difficult for the guys inside to actually organize getting the telephone at the right time, but we figured it out. And these live from death row events were incredibly powerful because it enabled people who were condemned to death by the state to tell their stories themselves to audiences around the country. Really, we had chapters in cities around the country that hosted these events. And whenever someone called in, you could hear a pin drop. But I think it was empowering because people did not have the ability to do this previously, even at their trials or during the appeals process. Oftentimes lawyers speak for their clients, and they're limited in terms of what it is that they can actually say. So having the ability to talk to audiences was incredibly powerful. And it's when people on death row organize themselves, that's when I think the anti-death penalty movement was actually transformed here in Illinois and also nationally. So it's really through this work with people on death row that I became particularly interested in disrupting the dominant narrative about people who are considered the worst of the worst. The death penalty was supposed to be reserved for those who committed the most heinous crimes. And when I started doing this work and meeting people who were on death row, I did indeed find people who had carried out acts of violence, but I also found people who became co-strugglers. I found people who had grown and evolved. I found people who were convicted of crimes they had not committed. I found people who were both deeply flawed and beautiful. And I found people who I forged lasting friendships with and now consider chosen family. I found no one, I'll tell you what I didn't find. I found no one who I thought deserved to be executed by the state, no one who was beyond redemption. I learned so much working alongside people on death row, but I think one of the most abiding lessons can be captured in a quote by James Baldwin. Who said, the impossible is the least one can demand. And given the hold of carceral logic at the time, I remember the first vigil that I went to in 1995 outside of Stateville. There was actually a group of townies there who were celebrating execution, who were playing music and dancing right outside the prison. Given the hold of carceral logic, the abolition of the death penalty felt impossible. But people like Ronaldo Hudson insisted that their lives mattered and refused to give into this logic. The other lesson that I learned is that it's not only possible, but essential to build relationships of reciprocity with people who are incarcerated in our prisons as we do the work of imagining and building new futures. And this continues to be a central tenet of my work today. Because people in prisons are effectively disappeared, this means that many of us, most of us, most people on the outside have very little idea what being caged in a prison is actually like. So we have this situation that prisons are ever present in our lives. We take prisons for granted. The notion that if you do the crime, you do the time is one that is ever present. And yet prisons are also simultaneously absent from our lives. This is something that Angela Davis writes eloquently about in her seminal text, Are Prisons Obsolete? She says, to think about the simultaneous presence and absence is to begin to acknowledge the part played by ideology in shaping the way we interact with our social surroundings. We take prisons for granted, but are often afraid to face the realities they produce. We tend to think of the prison as disconnected from our own lives. This is even true for some of us, women as well as men, who have already experienced imprisonment. We thus think about imprisonment as a fate reserved for others, a fate reserved for evildoers. This othering is one of the ideological impacts of mass incarceration. This othering is something that is so important to confront, dismantle, and disrupt. It's what Dr. Higginbotham started with, quoting Brian Stevenson, that we must get proximate to injustice, and we indeed do need to do that. In recent years, there have been profound changes to the public conversation around prisons and mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander popularized the notion that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow of our era, and we saw a new national debate around mass incarceration emerge. The Black Lives Matter movement took this further as young Black activists pushed the boundaries of politics and compelled us to theorize, discuss, and imagine, and put into practice the politics of police and prison abolition. And yet, even as local and national forces mobilize to decarcerate our prisons and end mass incarceration, those facing life sentences, those who are considered the worst of the worst, those who are PNAP students at Stateville are often left out of the conversation. And this is where it's critical for us to build and create platforms for truth telling, like the Live from Death Row events, and that we do this in collaboration with those who are marginalized and disappeared. And for me, this has meant doing this work in collaboration with people who are lifers and long-termers. And this is at the center of the work of the think tank at Stateville. So at the start of the pandemic, we just embarked upon a new project that we called Humans of Life Row. This project was in part inspired by the Humans of New York photography project that features photographs, images, and grew to also feature narratives of ordinary New Yorkers from all walks of life. And that is what we intended to do with the Humans of Life Row project. But really, for the last year and a half, since Friday, March 13th, 2020, I remember the date because we actually had set to have University of Chicago's first mixed enrollment class, bringing University of Chicago students into the prison to learn alongside University Without Walls students who were incarcerated. And that was the first day that we were supposed to go into the prison, but it was canceled because of the pandemic. And since that time, we have actually been teaching via correspondence. That means all of our lectures, all of our discussions have to be written out and sent in. And students then respond and participate in discussions by writing it all out. There are no computers that they have access to. Their technology is limited to a tablet they have access to very limited things on that tablet, and education right now is not a part of it. So we communicate through these weekly correspondence packets that we send in and send out. And I wanted to share with you what this looks like. This is a response from Benny Rios, who is part of the think tank. I think that his partner, wife, is also on this Zoom, Melly Rios. And Benny Rios described really, I think, eloquently what the aim of the Humans of Life Row project was. He says, I want the world to see a brilliant light being contained in a dark cell, just waiting to burst into the darkness of the world. The world would find that within these prison walls are a surplus of fathers, mothers, community leaders, restorative agents of change, and people who can light up the world and who are being warehoused, oppressed, silenced, and kept from the communities that need them. So the correspondence process is incredibly tedious, laborious, as you can imagine. Packets are all uploaded, weekly packets and assignments are all uploaded to a Google Drive. Then our class coordinator sends it to FedEx, has everything printed out, and essentially creates over 90 packets, individual packets for our students, hand delivers them to the prison, where prison staff then deliver the individual packets to our students in their individual cells, and then the reverse happens on the way back. So it's a laborious process, but the silver lining to this process is that during all of the suffering that people experienced as a result of the pandemic, the silver lining was that we were able to maintain community with our students. We were able to create things together. We were able to learn and grow together through these kinds of writings back and forth. So the Humans of Life Row project was actually initially intended as an oral history project. The pandemic made that impossible to do because educators are not able to have any correspondence outside of the classroom, outside of these packets. I can't write to a student and send it in through regular mail. I can't collect phone calls from students, and I can't communicate with anyone in the IDOC system through GTL. So what we did was we pivoted and we created prompts, questions to send in. And we also developed this 1 sentence a day daily diary project. And it was amazing, the kinds of responses we got back from folks. And again, it gave a glimmer of understanding into the daily life and experiences of people who were incarcerated during the pandemic. And this was especially, this is what it looked like, right? Benny was one of the people who religiously completed these daily entries. And this one stood out to me because it was describing and speaking to the pandemic itself. It's from March 14th, 2021. And he says, it's been a year and a day since any of us have been able to receive visits, go to chow, attend spiritual and academic programs, and so much more. The last time I saw my wife was on 3/13/20. I miss her. And then Devon Terrell, who is a poet and another student in the think tank, I wanted to just share one of his entries from Sunday, March 14th, 2021, because I think it shares a side of Devon that often we don't get to see inside our classrooms or in more traditional assignments. On Sunday, March 14th, he shared that my mind is firing on all cylinders, my body is active, my heart is full, I feel handsome and sexy, and I'm optimistic. So that is Devon. But I think what was beyond this, what was really exciting for me and for people who work with the think tank, volunteers who work with the think tank, and students who work with the think tank was figuring out how to create something, how to bring to life these responses. And this is one iteration that a group of students and former students worked on over the summer and created. You all are getting a sneak preview. It was just sent to the printer a few days ago, and we will be having printed copies of this chapbook very, very soon. This quote, "I walk into the future by visualizing it today," is also a quote from one of the students, Devon Terrell. So I wanted to say a word about the process because it was a very interactive process creating this chapbook. Students had the opportunity to correspond with people in the think tank, members of the think tank, to ensure that they had input on what was being created, that they gave their permission to actually create this chapbook. And what they created was incredibly beautiful and exquisite. Devon, again, responding to what makes you feel safe, saying that he does not know what safety feels like. This is an artwork that was put together, that was made by Devon. Mike Simmons responding to another James Baldwin quote about wearing a mask and taking off that mask, choosing to love himself, giving himself grace, daring to allow himself to grow. These are the kinds of responses that we got from our students inside. We also sent these prompts to women incarcerated at another facility who are in another teaching program there. And we're able to get responses from Janet Jackson, who said she's known for her advocacy and legal work and likes that. I'm also known for my crime and I don't like that. So we sent in prompts and questions that allow people to just show, that people who are serving, who have life sentences are not just one homogenous group. And here we have another from Rhonda Thompson about who she claims and who she's accountable to. I won't read everything on the slide. I know folks can read for themselves. And then this is Raul Dorado again, who I started with, who responded to the question, who are your people, the politically disenfranchised? And I think I wanted to end with this slide, this image in particular, because I think his charge that his people are the politically disenfranchised is something that can guide us as we continue to explore the impact of mass incarceration and do the work of ending mass incarceration. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Emily.
Alice, thank you for giving us such an intense look into the voices of individuals and their stories. I think it is so important for us to hear that. I'm wondering, one of the things that struck me about your talk was when you talked about imagine building a better future. And so given the many years that you have devoted to this work, when you are imagining building a better future, what do you think about? What do you see? what is different than what we are seeing and experiencing right now when you think about a better future?
So it's been over a year and a half since I've walked into Stateville Prison, but every time I walk in, it feels um, it's heartbreaking actually to leave, to know that we're walking outside the prison. It's a privilege to be able to go inside, and then it's a privilege to also be able to leave, right? And so when I imagine a different kind of future, I imagine that we can walk out of any place actually together, right? That we don't have that wall separating us, that we're able to see the humanity in all of us. One of the things that was particularly striking about the one sentence a day entries that I shared with folks is speaks to the kind of connectedness or disconnectedness that we have with people who are incarcerated. And one of the things it allowed when students in my incarceration and justice class at University of Chicago were also corresponding with students in the think tank at the time. And what resonated for people was that, okay, here Benny is talking about how he is not, he's frustrated because his playlist got lost from his tablet, right? And then Eric Watkins is sharing how his mother, on a specific day, he learned that his mother had been diagnosed with cancer. So the kind of empathy and ability to connect, and the way that the mundane connects all of us in some ways, that there's beauty in the mundane. I think that a future, a different kind of future would allow us to see our connectedness with one another.
Thank you. Clearly, the opportunity to devise writing experiences has been really important for people to be able to give voice, not only for the experience of writing for themselves, but to be able to, as we saw here today, to share those ideas. Can you talk to us about some of the things that you've learned by using writing in this context? And uh, are you doing the same kind of writing assignments now that you did when you first started, or what have you learned in terms of tools that have been helpful?
You know, teaching writing inside is teaching writing and writing, right, is incredibly challenging, difficult. And for anyone who is a writer, we know that it's all about revision, revision, and revision. And I had to rethink revision, writing, teaching writing inside, because people don't have computers. You can't just, it's very difficult to revise your writing, and you have to write something out completely by hand. If you're in a maximum security prison where you don't have computers, all over again. So I had to rethink that, and I also had to rethink question of vulnerability, right? We often say, if you're not going to be vulnerable on the page, sort of what's the point of writing, right? And while I still think that's true, it's a different kind of thing to insist on, to urge, and to push when you're inside a prison, where, as you saw, Devon Terrell said that he never feels safe. So when safety is out of the question, right, asking people to be vulnerable is a difficult thing. But I know that Melissa Lorraine is on this Zoom. I think I saw her, and she also teaches movement therapy, and has said that in the classes, in the workshops that she's done, it's been very possible to get people to a place of vulnerability. But oftentimes it takes someone on the inside also helping to foster that kind of environment. So for me, I think it's about building trust, and that means building trust with people over time, right? Many PNAP faculty, we do have some faculty who go in and teach a class, and we want that to be possible, but there are a core group of faculty who continue to build relationships with people all along so that trust can actually build. And the think tank is actually unique. It's not a class with a beginning and an end. We've been going since 2018 when we started. Some people have cycled in and cycled out, but it's a core group of people that are working together, and we've built trust with one another.
Thank you so much, Alice, for those insights.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
Thanks for those questions. And I'm eager to hear you talk about your storytelling work.
Great. I'm going to just take a moment to prepare to share my screen. So many of you may be wondering, what does storytelling have to do with the work of liberation, with addressing the impact of mass incarceration? And so I'd like to take some time to talk a little bit about what I believe to be the transformative power of storytelling, and specifically thinking about ethical storytelling and how this work has had an impact on my life, and the opportunities that I have had to share with others. I'm going to be sharing a lot of quotes that I think are sort of grounding for the work. And not so much from the author of the quote, but I loved this quote. What role does storytelling play in this work? Liberation is always in part a storytelling process, breaking stories, breaking silences, making new stories. A free person tells her own story. A valued person lives in a society in which her story has a place. And I think that what is particularly important about this work is that we find the places to give voice to those who have been silent, have been silenced, and to acknowledge the significance of stories that have been made to feel that they are not significant. And so the question of why should we think about ethical storytelling, and why should we think about it now? Alice spoke about the movements that have happened over the last several years to address the fact that the carceral state needs to be addressed and changed. And this quote says, "People are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history, when the survival of our planet and the restoration of our humanity require a great sea change in our ecological, economic, political, and spiritual values." And I have seen that one of the reasons that storytelling can be a transformative tool is that it nurtures the imagination, which for many of us can often feel as if it has been silenced. One of the people whose work has always really inspired me was Wangari Maathai, who did very significant work in Kenya. She's a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and she fought a lot of political battles in her work. And one of the things that she said was that when she was feeling discouraged, what she would go to be uplifted was a very simple story. It's a story of the hummingbird. And the story says that there was a horrible fire in the forest, and all of the large and seemingly powerful animals were running as quickly as they could away from the fire. And there was a tiny little hummingbird that was flying over the fire to a tiny bit of water and picking up what she could carry in her beak and going and dropping these tiny droplets of water on the fire. And the larger animals look up at this tiny hummingbird dropping these little drops of water and say, "What are you doing?" And the hummingbird answers, "I am doing the best that I can." And I think that in the face of a system that is designed to destroy our humanity, those of us who are fighting against it need that kind of encouragement that comes from stories that reminds us that the best that we can do is important. And so thinking about the power of telling stories, I go back to this quote, which reminds us that many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And that is why it is important that we tell many stories, that we not believe that we can understand a people by understanding or hearing a singular story, but that the space and opportunity that we can create to have a fabric of narratives is critically important in this time. And so I wanted to think about uh, this idea of what is the social impact of storytelling, um, and why storytelling as opposed to just writing, or what is important about it. And here we look at the idea that it's one thing to read about a social issue on paper. It's another to learn about an actual person's experience with that issue and putting a face or a voice to the story. And yet, it's important to remember that with the power of storytelling comes a great responsibility. There's a fine line between telling a person's story and using their story, and between empowering someone's voice through storytelling and exploiting them. And that's, I think, part of what has drawn me to this notion of ethical storytelling. And I've had the opportunity to work with some nonprofit organizations to think about this question of how do we use storytelling, but use it ethically. The idea that we might collect a person's story and not keep the story connected to that person is problematic. So when I collect someone's story and I begin to share that story, that person should have voice in how the story is shared and what pieces of the story is shared. Um, I may feel comfortable telling you my story. I may not be comfortable with you telling my story to the world. I may feel comfortable telling you my story and having you write it, but I may not want it broadcast. And this idea of uh, if it is important that we get the stories out, how do we do it in such a way that is ethical? And there's a social movement in ethical storytelling, and they talk about this idea that we believe people's stories are more than emotion generating machines, that story consumers are more than guzzlers of emotions, and that stories should always be constituent first, sort of thinking about the person, not thinking about what benefit are we seeking to gain from the story. So we aspire to tell stories that are truthful, nuanced, educational, and empowering, and not just for branding to draw attention to a piece, but to think about what is the context of the story and how it allows us to extend our sense of humanity, and to be, used more broadly in the world. And so when I think about ethical storytelling and how we are thinking about using stories, I'm thinking about what is the point of origin, what story needs to be told in what moment. Um, if I have an organization that is trying to address these issues, are only the stories of the people that we're working with important? Are all the stories, or is the story of the organization important? Is the story of the staff who may have been transformed by an experience important? Again, how are we collecting the story? How are we saving the story or documenting the story? How is the story shared? I know that my experience of the stories that Alice just shared is very different when I see those stories in someone's own handwriting. It feels that that person still has a voice in the sharing of their story. So even though they have been denied the opportunity to have access to a typewriter or to a tape recorder in order so that we might hear their voice, we are able to look and see their handwriting. And so when that story is shared, it is shared in such a way that it allows that person's humanity to be part of it. So really thinking, how are we collecting stories? How do we share them? How do we, use them in ways that are empowering? What role does the storytelling play, or our organizations? And what is the ongoing relationship? One of the things that Alice talked about was being able to establish trust. And so trust is established over developing ongoing relationships. It's not, I'm going to go into a space one time, get a story, and then use that story to activate people's ideas about this issue, but it's keeping the story connected to the person or community that it came from. And then what about the experience of storytelling is frightening? What about it is rewarding? So these are some of the things that I try to think about when I'm going into context to help people learn to tell stories and to think about how that work can be done ethically. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I did with Alice. She invited me in to do a workshop with people who were torture survivors. And very often when I'm doing a storytelling workshop, I'm thinking about what are different prompts that I can put into the space to give people the opportunity to tell stories. So in this particular context, we did one prompt where I put out just a whole bunch of different objects, which might range from a tea bag to a baseball to cinnamon, and gave people the opportunity to, when you look at these objects, does a memory come to mind? Because often if you say to somebody, can you tell me a story about what happened to you? It can be overwhelming, but starting in bits and pieces can be safer, more liberating. And then we started to talk about memories, and starting from childhood memories and going into life memories. And one of the participants in the workshops sort of said, you're asking me questions that I can't answer because I feel like my life was stolen. And so I feel like I don't have access to the kinds of experiences that you're talking about. And he felt initially very shut down. But as other people in the circle started to share, he began to focus on memories that were related to the strength of his relationship with his mother. And it became a rather transformative and empowering experience for him to be able to share memories of the strength and power of that relationship. And so I do not think that that experience would have been the same if we hadn't been in a circle, and that there was something about the circle of people telling stories and having the opportunity to hear each other and each other's voices was significant. So when we think about how we're collecting stories, it's not only important that I come in and tell you a story, or that I create a space for a singular person to share their story, but creating space for people to hear each other's stories can also be important and encouraging. Um, I also was blessed over the last several months to do work with a group called the Mamas. And Mamas is a collective of people who are on the front line of communities targeted by state violence. And they are really freedom fighters. And they are mothers of people who have been taken, is the language that they use. And I was asked to come in and work with this group and to think about how their stories might be used as a tool of advocacy to draw attention to the cases of their children. And I was initially asked, could you work with them to tell their stories so that we might have short sound bites that could be shared on social media? And I almost didn't take the project because I thought that's not really the way that I work. I'm really about helping people to tell their stories, but we were able to create a format that actually I think worked for everyone involved. I'll tell you a little bit more about the group, and then I'll go into the process that we used. So the group that we worked with described themselves as mothers of the kidnap, which includes people who are mothering and caring for survivors of Chicago police torture and frame-ups. Their program, Reproductive Healing Justice, insists that police violence is a feminist issue that denies predominantly BIPOC people who mother the opportunity to care for and protect their loved ones. They integrate collective healing and activism. And after decades in and out of courts with no results, while enduring the ripple effects of incarceration, our economic, mental health, and physical well-being, we are tired of waiting for a broken justice system to work. And now we fear our loved ones will die in a COVID-19 infested cell. This is why we have come together to heal together while advocating for the liberation of our loved ones and each other. And so I was invited through the Old Town School of Folk Music to work with my partner, who was a vocalist, with the mamas to help them to tell their stories. It was an 8-week session. And the first concern was about creating a nurturing community. So how are we going to create a space that will allow people to feel safe in the sharing of these stories? And so we did some work in terms of thinking about what are our collective values that we share. Everyone contributed to a song list of music that was nurturing for them. And then we spent 3 weeks on this idea of building community. And what was significant about that was that we did story prompts where people who were members of the Mamas group, who had been working together for years, given the opportunity to share their own memories about their own lives, were like, oh, I've been in this group with you for 10 years and had no idea about that, about you. I am now seeing you in a different way because I know more about you. And so we use the storytelling process as a way to strengthen the sense of community that they'd already created. And then we went into this idea of how are we going to begin to collect these stories that might be used for advocacy. And I knew that it can be overwhelming to say, tell us the story of what happened. And so the first week we started out very small. Can you tell us just the beginning of the story? What's the beginning of what you want us to know? And many went into telling the whole story, but that the question being asked in that way was sort of freeing. I can tell you how it all started. After that week, I was really thinking about what structure can I do? What can I create to help people to share their stories, and in such a way that we will have stories that are shorter, that we'll be able to use, in, which was part of the goal of the project, but also allow people to get into some of the most meaningful aspects of their stories. And so I came up with this concept of 3 wishes. And so everyone was asked, can you share 3 wishes? First wish, what do you wish people knew about your story? Like, what's the piece? If you can't tell the whole thing, what's the part that's most important? What do you wish people knew about your story? Secondly, what do you wish people knew about the person that you love? Because very often it felt in listening to them that they felt that their sons had been reduced to the sentence that happened to them and not to the full human being that they are, the full human beings that they are. So the question was, what do you wish people knew about this person that you love? And finally, what do you wish people knew about the justice system? And the structure of 3 wishes was very helpful in allowing each person to sort of feel like they had a guide that they could navigate, but they also were able to give voice to some of the most important parts of what had happened to them and to their families. And after giving over a course of a couple of weeks time for everyone to share their 3 wishes, we also went to, if you only get to tell one part of the story, what's the very most important thing? But I noticed that the experience of telling these stories, like by the end of the session, people were weeping because of the depth of injustice And it was particularly challenging. So I didn't want to do a lot of rehearsal, but the decision was made that we would be working with a filmmaker, and that because all of our sessions were conducted on Zoom, that we would do one in-person session where people would share their three wishes, and that session would be filmed, and then they would be able to take pieces of the story to use for advocacy, so that we were able to have this larger storytelling process that could have impact in a variety of ways. One of the things that happened when we came together for the in-person session was that at the end of the three wishes, one person also talked about the impact on her family, and she really focused on that. She talked about how this was her only son, and how because of the kind of prison sentence that he was experiencing, that she did not believe that she would ever have grandchildren. And she felt that the line of her family was ending, and there was a sense of hopelessness and brokenness that she experienced, and that had impacted her entire family. And we then asked everyone, can you take a moment to talk about the impact that this experience has had on your family? And one of the things that really stood out for me was throughout the workshop, people had talked about the impact of watching their children not be able to live their full lives. But when they were asked to talk about what is the impact that it had on you as a parent, or that it had on your family, there was a sense of that even after years of fighting, how determined they continued to be, but also how exhausted they were. And I remember one of the mamas talking about how sometimes in the summertime, she would go into the house and turn off the air conditioning. And especially on summer days where there might be something very exciting happening outside, she would stay in the house in the dark with no air conditioning, because she was imagining, why should I have the opportunity to experience the joy of everything that is happening around me when my child cannot? So there was a sense of feeling like the only way that I can be with my child when I cannot be with my child and touch my child is to try to create an experience that is similar to the experience that they are having, so that they can perhaps feel my spirit with them in this moment. And that really struck me. The power of these freedom fighters was just particularly impactful. And then to think about the story that is told, the stories that we hear, but also the importance of the environment in which those stories are shared. So that circle that we created for all of those people who are fighting for the freedom of their children, to hear from each other the violence that happened, how they were fighting against it, was so important. So I just wanted to say, for those of us that are interested in storytelling and how it may connect to this work, that there's significance in the story that is told, but also, again, in how it is shared. And just a couple closing quotes. When we think about this idea, again, of impact and the impact on families, this from Michelle Alexander. For children, the era of mass incarceration has meant a tremendous amount of family separation, broken homes, poverty, and a far, far greater level of hopelessness as they see so many of their loved ones cycling in and out of prison. Children who have incarcerated parents are far more likely to themselves be incarcerated, which is a disturbing thought and important for us to all continue in the fight. And finally, we started the evening with a thought from Bryan Stevenson, and I am closing my presentation with a thought from Bryan Stevenson as well. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others. The closer we get to mass incarceration and extreme levels of punishment, the more I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy. We all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. Um, I know the mamas that you worked with, and I know that your workshops with them were incredibly powerful. And I'm also thinking back to the storytelling workshop that you did with survivors and how powerful that was. We had the same experience, I think, that you shared about the mamas, people who are often working alongside one another in the same spaces with one another, but often either teaching about the systematic injustices or strategizing various advocacy efforts, how to push one thing or another. So during that storytelling session, we all learned so much about one another. I have a question for you that is speaks to the question of performing storytelling, right? Because I think there's a whole industry around performative storytelling, and I've also seen you perform stories. And then we're also talking about a very different kind of storytelling, whether it's with people who are incarcerated, telling their stories through by responding to prompts or responding to the prompts in a storytelling circle. Can you talk a little bit about, where things might get complicated in terms of the performance of storytelling and authenticity, if I'm making sense?
I think that there's a question of when I am performing a story that is my own story, and when I'm performing a story that is my own story, am I, sort of in what context am I telling it? And when I'm teaching other people sort of like tools to be able to tell their own stories, how much of the story do you tell? And do we feel that the story is less true if you leave out, this part? How do we get to what is the essence of what is most important to be shared and still be truthful and honoring? But then also there's the reality that there may be people who I really want my story to be told, but I don't want to tell it, you know. And so I think that um, is also important because it can be empowering for someone to say, I'm giving you my story. I am trusting you with um, bringing my truth to a larger audience. So I think that can be really important. And when doing that, I'm always thinking about how to stay true to the essence. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. I was also really moved by the questions, the framing of the three wishes. I think it's a really powerful way to enter into a conversation with people who have experienced incredible trauma in their lives, and where there's a sense of openness where people can decide what they want to share and what they may not want to share. Can you say a little bit more about how you develop your thinking in terms of developing the three wishes and the questions that were part of the three wishes?
I will say that the experience of initially hearing the mamas start to tell their stories, I realized how emotionally drained I was as a mother of four Black sons, hearing about the trauma that their families have experienced, continue to experience, and over so many years of fighting battles where they just feel that they are not winning. And I was sort of amazed by, how do you continue this fight? And really trying to think about how to frame the question in a way where it allows them to feel that they have some power. Because when you say, sort of like, it's a different thing to say, what happened to you that was wrong, than to say, what do you wish people knew about your story? Um, and not that both questions aren't valid, but I was trying to think about, how can I ask the question in a way where the person feels that they are stepping into some power when they're sharing it.
Thanks so much, Emily. It's always a joy to work with you, and I'm looking forward to projects that we have been discussing and thinking about for the future, and also continuing the storytelling workshops with torture survivors. I think we did want to open it up to some folks who are in the audience to also share at this time. I know Ronaldo Hudson is in the Zoom room, and wanted to ask, as someone who is a human of Life Row, wanted to ask Ronaldo if he'd like to say a few words. Also, I think Dio Adayu, who's one of the creators, and also Pablo Mendoza, who's been active in the chat, also creators of the Humans of Life Row chapbook that you saw excerpts of, are in the Zoom room. So wanted to invite them if they'd like to say anything on audio as well. Just please let us know. Here's Ronaldo. Great. Ronaldo, can you say a word about your working with people now? Now you're on the outside, and now you're reaching back with people on the inside. If you want to say a word about that work and anything else you'd like to speak to.
Can you hear me now, Alice?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hey, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question, please?
You spent over 30 years, many of them on death row, incarcerated, and then with a life without the possibility of parole sentence, and then you were released last September. You've been out a year, and you've been going hard, going strong, and reaching back to people on the inside. Do you want to share anything about that work, how you think we can amplify voices and voices from people who are incarcerated?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like, first of all, through moments like this, inviting those of us who have been directly impacted into the conversation. So thank you, Alice. And I love this because you did this when I was on death row, and you helped to amplify the voices of those of us that were waiting to die by execution by our great state. And so I really always am humbled when I see you, and I'm reminded of the soldier that you are. But to go to your question directly, I think it's imperative that people see us and hear us and see that we're not monsters. We're just, in many cases, people who've made bad decisions. And that the best of us is when we see the worst in people and we reach a hand out to them and say, maybe no one ever reached out and tried to figure out what went wrong with this person. And just a little kindness. It's not always about, big projects. It's sometimes something as simple as a smile, something as simple as doing a video visit. It's so many different things, looking at the organizations that are actually doing great work, right? And joining and supporting them. Like, everybody know that right now there's a big push and a struggle with having fresh water. Like, to be able to, it's Stateville, right? The place where you actually teach, the brothers need a drink, right? And so that you're looking for them to turn in their homework, and they're like, I'm thirsty, I need some water. And so just understanding the real reality of incarceration, death by incarceration is a real thing. And make no mistake about it, that if people don't get engaged, and you can get engaged, in my humble opinion, through looking at different organizations. I'm actively connected with the Illinois Prison Project. And as the director of education, I go out and speak and let people see my pretty face, and they realize, hey, he's not a monster. He may have did a bad thing, but he's not a monster. And he can speak. That's amazing. There are thousands of men and women that are still incarcerated that can articulate a verb. Like, they can actually express themselves in a really good way. And so giving us the opportunity is the best thing I could suggest, Alice. And you did it from death row to the front door, and you still continually reach for us. And so I want to hopefully walk in your footsteps and continually reach back into the population and say, now that I'm home, I haven't forgotten all the slaves, because there's the only place that slavery is still legal is after conviction and incarceration. And so all the slaves that are trying to get their voice back, we owe it to them to say, if I can't hear you because I didn't give you ear, right? I'm gonna give you ear. So I'm saying, like, give ear to the pains and the screams that are occurring even while this wonderful event is occurring. Men and women are sitting in caves, hurting, and they need our voices to speak out for them.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Ronaldo.
Absolutely.
There's so much I could say about Ronaldo, but I know that our time is running short, so I might add a little bit more about Ronaldo's story later. But I see that Dio has been given the ability to be on audio, and I think maybe video as well, if she'd like. Dio, did you want to say a word about the process of working on the Humans of Life Row book? Hey, Dio.
Hey, wow. I just want to say it was a huge pleasure to work on the Humans of Life Row chapbook with you and everyone else, and especially since I'm still a student, I definitely felt like I got a true education just by working on the chapbook and being able to sort of use people's stories, use people's voices in this way. And I'm so honored that people, specifically the people inside and the people that we worked with, really felt seen and validated by our work.
Thanks, Dio.
Hey, Alice, you had said another name before, and I just don't remember what it was, but I wanted to get them in as well. Do you have
Pablo Mendoza. Pablo Mendoza works with Parole, Illinois, also a community fellow with the lab. Pablo, you want to say a word?
He's coming in now. Oh, Pablo, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about it. Hello, everybody. I'm working on getting my house together after work and school, so we're trying to get this together. So what is the prompt here, Alice?
You worked on the Humans of Life Road chapbook as well, right? And just what that process was like for you. And also now someone being on the outside who also reaches back to folks on the inside. How do we uplift those stories? How do we uplift the experiences of people who are serving long-term sentences?
Yeah, serving on the Humans of Life Road project was an experience. I got to do it as a part of a class project that then extended outside of it. It was more of a community than it was a class, so I really enjoyed it. Dayo and Yazoo did excellent work with their pictorials, and the communication that it took and logistics that it took to get done was extensive, but we got it there. I love hearing about narratives and different people's narratives, and this was a way to bring out the voice to those who are voiceless. I think that's important when we're dealing with trying to promote change in this system that's not broken but working exactly like it's supposed to. And yeah, so to me, I always look to bring the voice to everybody who's voiceless so that people can hear these stories and connect with them, because at the end of the day, like Ronaldo said, we're just people, right? We speak, we eat, we talk, and like everybody else, we make our mistakes, and most of us make ours as youth and then get punished for the rest of our lives. So it's important that we recognize people for who they are today and not the worst act that they committed in their life.
Thanks for sharing that, Pablo. So true. So true.
Right now, we don't have any other questions or comments in the chat or in the question and answer box. Wasn't sure if there was another name that you had spotted throughout our chat that you wanted to see if anybody wanted to share another story or anything.
It looks like Lisa has a question.
Yep, Dr. Brock, can you unmute and turn your camera on?
These things always take longer than you think to hit these buttons, right? I just want to say I really appreciate what Alice and Emily shared with us this evening, and the chat has been very rich. While we may not have a lot of questions, there's a lot of things that were said. One was for Alice. It said, your work reminded me of Margaret Burroughs' book, Black Men Speak from Behind the Walls. There's a power of storytelling. Everyone identifies with a hurting mother. Just a lot of great things in the chat that we can capture. Edith Jackson said, I truly appreciate the broadened awareness of the problems of prisoners from viewing, of othering, loss of voting rights, etc. Encouraged to learn the transformative power of writing, of the writing process. So I just wanted to say this has really been rich. It's touched my heart. And I just wanted to commend you too for the work you do, and also Ronaldo and the others with the Humans of Life Row project. So I just wanted to commend you for the workshop and for touching us all and making sure that we don't forget, or as you say, move on with our lives as if this is not a part of it. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We do have a question in the chat now, and it says from Dr. Deborah Tillman, how can we get involved in your projects? So I guess that's both for Alice and Emily. How can someone get involved in your projects if that's available?
Well, actually, the Humans of Life Row project is an ongoing project. We are going to be sharing the prompts with anybody who wants to actually complete them, who is a Human of Life Row, and we're going to be building an archive online. And we will have different iterations of the Humans of Life Row chapbook. This is one iteration, right? We also had another artist, local artist, create digital collages responding to people's responses inside. So once we create this archive, I think we want to invite everyone to create. But also, if you know people who are incarcerated, you can share the Humans of Life Row prompts with them. But I think that just because not everybody is local, right? I think people are all over the country. One thing that I urge everyone to do is what Dr. Higginbotham started off with, is to get proximate to injustice, right? So I urge everyone to visit a prison, to go inside a prison, to see what it's actually really like, to get a pen pal who is incarcerated, to write somebody who is incarcerated. Carceral logic tells us that, you know, we should have nothing to do with people who are incarcerated. When actually, in fact, our lives are enriched when we have relationships with people behind bars, and it really exposes the problem of prisons when you are in touch with someone who is inside. Encourage all of your legislators in whatever state you're in to actually go inside and talk to people who are there. In Illinois, we're actually hoping to pass legislation this fall that will allow voting rights, that will restore voting rights to people in prison. So think about what kind of legislation you can support wherever it is that you are. We're also pushing for legislation to bring a parole system back in Illinois. Everyone has life without the possibility of parole in Illinois. Illinois is one of 6 states where every life sentence is a life without the possibility of parole system. Sentence. So I know Pablo and I and others are headed down to Springfield, and that chapbook, we think of it as legislative art, a term that was coined by Lori Jo Reynolds, another activist scholar, artist scholar here in the local area. Legislative art, we're handing it out. We're going to put it into the hands of legislators as people lobby for parole legislation. So think creatively and expansively about how you can change hearts and minds.
I wanted to mention in terms of ways that people could get involved. I would love to see people support the Mamas Project to keep up with the work that they're doing. And I also saw a comment about the question of micro and macro work. And I know that with the Mamas that they are working not only for the lives of their individual sons, but for changes in the system more broadly here in Illinois. And they've been doing some really important advocacy and work. So I put their website in and would love to encourage people to keep abreast of their work and to support them.
Thank you. I also see that Dr. Hickenbotham has her hand raised. Before we get to the next question, I was going to let Dr. Hickenbotham speak. Dr. Higginbotham, can you come off?
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute and undo this. Thank you. I was thinking, since I was quoting Brian Stevenson at the beginning about proximate, but one of the big points that Brian Stevenson makes always is about the importance of hope, and how hope is just so crucial to anything. And I was thinking, especially about the arts, because one of the reasons we so appreciate you is that, as I said in my introduction of you, you truly capture the 3 pathways that Howard had identified. And the arts is so important, not only the storytelling, but I've seen projects where people work with the visual arts. And the visual arts, I had a student who had a project in Louisiana where it became a family. They worked with those people, the incarcerated people were doing the art and then giving it to my students and his group, because he was teaching in New Orleans then, and they gave it to the families of those people. And it was so moving to them to see that level of creativity. So I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, do you find that people explicitly talk about a certain level of hope that they feel with regard to the creative process, the arts in some form, be it storytelling or visual arts, or I think of Reginald Dwayne Betts and the poetry that he writes? I mean, there's so many ways that the arts can enrich us emotionally. So I'd like to hear you just talk about that.
I saw Ronaldo come back on screen, and Ronaldo is an amazing artist. So do you want to speak to this, Ronaldo?
Absolutely. I almost jumped out of my seat when I heard her give such an articulate idea about the importance of hope. I subscribe to the biblical idea that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when it comes, it's like a tree of life. And one of the things that gave me a sense of stability, because I served 37 straight years, was that I began to be able to paint And I found through the process of painting, I found the freedom that incarceration couldn't take from me. And even when they take the supplies and they would cut our brushes, we would be like, but I can still see the vision. And where there is no vision, people perish. And so through the art, people begin to see vision bigger than them bars. And so absolutely the arts and the support of making sure people are able to express themselves, if it's through the art itself or it's through the art of speaking, that is an art in itself. And getting your voice. So yes, art. It is some amazing artists that are still incarcerated that the world will be blown away of seeing that beauty can come from ashes. So yeah, absolutely. Wait, y'all keep watching. Like it's some good stuff coming. It's coming. But yes, Alice, I'm sorry. I'm kind of long-winded, but that just excited me. Like because people don't know that the moments when you want to give up and then you are able to just transfer that anxiety into a canvas, you know, it's so empowering. Yeah, absolutely.
We have one question from Maria, and I didn't know if she wanted to ask it or if she wanted me to read it, so I'm going to allow her to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of it. I heard you say that you have 4 sons, and I wanted to know, how does your work affect you having 4 sons, African-American male sons, and how does it, I guess I'm trying to say, are you more secure with them? Are you have this wraparound with them? Do you paint a picture with them of what life really is? I work with African-American males. I'm a behavior specialist, and I work with African-American males who I wish could hear sometimes what it is to be incarcerated and for someone to get their freedom back and to be free and to be able to think outside the box and live. I mean, does it make it harder for your sons? Or does it help you to have a smoother transition for their future? Or is this just a really crazy question?
No, it's a great question, because I think people often do not acknowledge sort of the complexities of parenting, and maybe for some people it's been really easy. It's been challenging for me, and I am, incredibly blessed. My sons are 23, 22, 17, and 15. I have a child who's special needs, who has autism, and I have really, I will say that I think that the work that I've read that most significantly impacted my parenting of Black boys was that while I was carrying my first son, I read Nathan McCall's Makes Me Want to Holler. And it chronicles his time in prison, and then his experience of becoming a journalist. And one of the things that he talks about is that when he was in prison, he learned how to play chess, and that learning to play chess changed his life because of the thought process that he learned of learning that there are consequences to things. And so I think as a parent, always been conscious of trying to have my sons understand, in the way that they look at the world, you have the opportunity to make choices. There are consequences for those choices, but you are part of a community and you are responsible to that community. The arts have been critical to the way that they have learned to express them in the world. So my son, who has autism, is a visual artist, and I can't imagine him in the world if he did not have the resource of being able to make art. He makes art every day, all the time. Two of my sons are storytellers, and all 3 of the others are poets. And poetry has been an extremely powerful tool, and they're being able to speak about their experience, but also to be able to advocate for social justice issues that are important to them, and to recognize how they are connected to community. I have always been very involved with young people in teaching and creating spaces for young people to perform their words and ideas, and through nurturing storytellers and poets. And I think that creating spaces for young people to speak their words and to have their words be heard and acknowledged, and to recognize that they are not alone, that they are connected to community, and that being connected to community makes them have also a sense of responsibility in the world, have been really important parts of the ways that I have parented. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, I think that was our last question, and I'm going to pass it back to Michelle.
This has been a wonderful evening. Alice and Emily, do you have something you'd like to say in wrapping up?
I'll just say a word in response to the question about hope. I think that developing, building relationships, building community with people inside is actually something that gives people hope. I think people are so isolated when you're incarcerated, and that is entirely intentional. But it is very possible to build community, to build relationships of reciprocity. I think the chapbook making process is one small example of how that's possible. And I know that think tank members were excited as they saw the evolution of their words and their response to homework prompts, right, being developed into something creative, and to know that now students are actually going to go down to Springfield, have learned about parole in Illinois, and are going to lobby legislators and hand them one of these chapbooks to show these are the people that we're saying deserve a chance at parole. So, and having their cases heard, to have the possibility of being paroled. So I think that kind of community is incredibly important.
I think I'd like to say that when we survey our history and the times where significant moments of changes in our communities fighting for justice, that many times radical change has started from the single story of what happened to someone, to Emmett Till, to George Floyd, to many people, and the ways in which those stories were magnified, but also the ways in which people felt a connection to a sense of humanity. And I think that the ways in which we provide opportunities and space to hear more of each other's stories, I know that the opportunity to work with the mamas completely changed me. I don't know that I would be such a vocal, loud freedom fighter after my son had been in prison for 20 years, still saying, I believe in change, I'm not giving up. And to see the significance of those stories was truly inspiring and an honor for me. So it was an honor to share stories in the space tonight. And I hope that we will all be inspired by recognizing that we are in community, and that collectively we are more powerful than we are individually. Thank you.
This has been really wonderful. Before you all leave, I'd like to bring on a few folks to share some additional items. We have with us Dr. Nikki Taylor. None of this would be possible without Dr. Taylor from Howard University. Dr. Taylor, would you like to share a few words with us, please?
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this wonderful 6-week engagement with social justice. This workshop today was absolutely life-changing, and it's exactly what I envisioned when I wrote the grant with you guys' assistance of bringing academics and real-life people together to talk about social justice, in particular, criminal justice for this first year of the grant. I mean, I was absolutely moved by Alice and Emily, and Ronaldo had just a transformative effect on my soul. Like I'm being pushed to do more than I do now. And so it was incredibly moving. And I speak for myself and Howard University and all of the countless Howard students who are on this call. This is just what we always needed to have been doing in order to improve the quality of life for all members of our community. And it is imperative that we have these conversations between intellectuals and activists and come up with some real life strategies to combat these ills that we have been crushed under in so many ways. And so I thank you, Michelle, for your vision and your brilliance in designing this. And I just think you need to be commended. I loved it. I loved every one of these workshops. I think we must continue. ASALA is an organization that's very near and dear to my heart, as is Howard. We must continue this long after the grant has ended, because we must, it's necessary. And so I want to thank you and Dr. Higginbotham and Sylvia Cyrus and everybody for your support. And I just thank the audience for coming and participating and having an open heart and a will and openness to communicate. And I'm going to end there, but it's everything we imagine. And finally, I guess I forgot to thank the Mellon Foundation, who wanted us to push the envelope and to create something that had never before been done between the academy and the rest of the world, to make what we do usable. And we can't make it usable unless people who have been crushed by injustice inform us in our work. So I want to thank you all today, and it's been really great these last 6 weeks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. And I want to join with you in thanking the entire team, Dr. Brock, who curated these sessions for us, our other speakers, Dr. Serena Sebring, as well as our speakers tonight, and of course, the ASALA family and everybody who joined in to make this possible. My team here, Nick and Christina and Terrence, our IT person, as well as Eileen. You've just been invaluable. So in closing, Dr. Higginbotham, would you like to wrap it up for us?
Well, I just again want to thank everybody. Tonight was amazing. It really did kind of bring everything together. I want to thank you, Alice, for your commitment. I think Ronaldo called you a soldier. Thank you. I want to thank you, Emily, for just the serenity with which you speak in telling stories must make people feel calm, and the way you shared about even how you respond and the questions that you ask to get people to tell their stories. All this is so needed. And we don't have Serena here today, but one of the things that she talked about, Emily and Alice, was about Black women, especially mamas also, who are just incarcerated and they haven't even had a trial yet. They are arrested on a misdemeanor. They go to court, they can't post bail, and then for months they're sitting in in prisons. For Lisa, I mean, Lisa, we can't even begin to thank you for curating this entire event and for all of your work and just setting the stage and getting us ready week by week through your diligence with terms and with understandings. You've just been marvelous. Now, we are planning to also have in the months ahead, in maybe not in October, but definitely in November and December, we're going to have book talks on Asala TV. And I noticed, like, for example, you, Alice, you have co-edited a book. These are just the kind of things we want to talk about. So we are going to continue this with faculty who've written books, but the books aren't just to be on shelves. These are books that speak to particular issues that need answers to. Maybe we'll even bring filmmakers in. But I know for this, for the rest of 21, we're going to do some important book talks. So we'll be back in touch with everybody about this. And thank you to our audience. I just want to tell you that you enriched us in a special way, because some of you were the people about whom we're talking, and you're teaching us. Ronaldo, you are a star. Pablo, when I read your chat about Inside Out, which you didn't even talk about, but that is, we want to hear about that, teaching like that. Dio, all the work that you're doing. So just you have enriched us. This is what the dialogue is all about. And we are honored to have been able to have shared your voices with so many people through these past 5 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. All of these sessions have been recorded and they will be available on Asala TV. So if you missed it, know that you'll be able to grab it from asala.org on Asala TV. Thank you so much. It's so good seeing everybody. All right, take care. Have a wonderful evening. Good night, Terrence.
Bye, Terrence, and everybody.
Thank you, Terrence, too.
The back of the house
Definitely.
team. Yeah.